All right, it's time for round two. So hello everybody and welcome back. If you watched the previous video, we developed film in both beer and then coffee. We developed TMAX 400. We took 2 rolls from the same exact box, developed 1 in beer and 1 in coffee, and the results were less than thrilling. That being said, they were my first attempts in both of those solutions. Yes, I could have done it 3-4 times, got it perfect, and then showed you, but what would be the fun in that? I prefer to show you the first attempt so you can see where I messed up and see how you can improve upon it or what things you might need to factor in along the way to make sure you don't get the results I did. That being said, we've since done round 2, but we've done a little bit different. We're not doing beer this time. This time what I did was develop an instant coffee, the same kind, same exact recipe that I used last time, just made some slight adjustments to the development time. And then I also did real coffee. Oh, it smells so much better. So now we're going to look at the results between the two, kind of tell you what I did and what my thought process was on this one, as well as kind of clarify some things that I said that people may or may not have agreed with last time, just so we're on the same page. So if you want a very accurate breakdown of both beer and both coffee, there are plenty of videos out there done on each one. You can search through all of them and get the exact recipes. So my personal recommendations for beer, I would go to the Art of Photography. He's very technical. He breaks it down, tells you exactly the thought process behind it and how he went about doing it. He does also mention that he thinks, he didn't of course try, but he thinks if you wanted to, you could develop it in just the beer. So his thought process behind that would be to do a stand development. And he said he'd probably leave it in there for about an hour, agitating every 10 minutes, because of course it doesn't have the boost in vitamin C or the baking soda to kind of boost the chemicals in there to get a quicker development time. He did not do it, to my knowledge, but he did say he thinks it is possible, which is where I got the idea that I thought it would be possible to do the same thing in coffee as well, since these are kind of done a lot, the 2 different beer and coffee scenarios. Now that brings us to the coffee aspect of it. James Hoffman, if you want to look about coffee, he is a coffee connoisseur. He is not a photography connoisseur, and he admits that, but he knows the science and the chemicals and everything's behind coffee. He was a barista world champion. This is probably the only video he's done based upon film photography. That being said, though, he knows what he's doing. So I followed his recipe for my coffee one, which we'll get to in a minute. But, so James talked about the main ingredient in coffee, and that is also found in other things, is caffeic acid. That is the key ingredient in coffee used to develop film. Now, if you talk about the beer and the coffee, the key thing to factor in is pH. Caffeic acid, of course, has a certain pH level. Caffeic acid is also found in fruits and vegetables. The key ingredients in the Super 8 beer that I used to develop previously, there was a lot of fruits, a lot of berries, things like that, lots of vitamin C, that kind of stuff to help boost the development for the beer. So when I talked about acidity last time, that was kind of what I was referring to, the fruitiness, that kind of aspect of it, which I'm accustomed to in coffee, and it was just very forward on the beer as well. Now, when it comes to coffee, caffeic acid is found mainly in lighter roasts. Instant coffee is a light roast. Basically what they do is they roast coffee, then they grind it up, put it into a big tank that uses pressure and steam to extract all of the flavors and things out of it to make the instant coffee. No idea how that works with the chemicals and everything behind that, but apparently it doesn't remove what is needed to develop film, which would be the caffeic acid part of it. Thinking of that, my thought process is if I can just use regular coffee, I would think I would have a higher concentration of the caffeic acid and things I need, since I'm not just using steam and pressure to extract it. Of course, I could be completely wrong. I'm actually using coffee fresh roasted within a couple weeks. It's not instant, that's been frozen and sitting there for a while. I'm going to get those chemicals and compounds that I need from the coffee directly out of it into the water. This is where the things kind of split, and we did different development times, different reactions, things like that. Now for this experiment, I did use TMAX 100 for both of these. I did shoot them in different lighting situations, so it's not going to be a perfectly valid experiment. This is more just a curiosity type thing. So last time for the instant coffee, it was a 12-minute development time. The first minute was continuous agitation, and then 11 minutes of agitation every 10 seconds on the minute is what I did. Followed, of course, by the stop bath and the fixer, which I will list that above. And I did the same exact stop bath and fixer for the regular coffee as well. And I will put up the breakdowns for both instant and regular right now so you can see those. And then I'm going to talk about the new recipe I did for regular. So the recipe I'm following is from James Hoffman. Now James used espresso instead of just regular drip coffee because you can get a higher concentration of coffee out of espresso than you can with drip. More or less, a double shot of espresso is the equivalent to a cup of coffee. Again, that's more or less. So that can be kind of used if we wanted to use just regular drip coffee. I think I'd probably use cold brew as the go-to. Of course, I'd let it sit down to room temperature, but you get a higher concentration of caffeine in cold brew. And I'm assuming the other ingredients needed, since you let it sit with the coffee grinds overnight, than you would with just a regular drip coffee. So since espresso is not exactly the easiest, cold brew might be the way to go in the long run, since I'm not sure how much it would take out of the drip. So for this recipe, 750 grams of total water is what we need. 405 grams of distilled water, 40.5 grams of washing soda, 12 grams of vitamin C, 375 grams of espresso, 30 grams of that is solubles, and 345 grams of that is water. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the instant coffee recipe called for a certain number of teaspoons, I think it was 5 teaspoons of instant coffee grounds. That would be your soluble material. And that, of course, is mixed with the water to get your concentration that you need to develop it. Now, for the record, I did mess up the instant coffee last time. If you remember, I didn't have enough water in there to develop the entire roll of 120 film. So I corrected that. Everything stayed the same as far as ingredients. I just added the correct amount of water to that developer. Now, this is where it gets a little complex, and James did a little bit of math to figure out how much he needed. James pulled espresso shots. He has a 20-gram basket. He pulled 50 grams of material out of that, and that's kind of the ratio he used to get the total of 375 grams of espresso to use in this mixture. My espresso machine, which eventually you'll see, has a 16-gram basket, so I don't pull quite the amount. So I had to adjust the amount of shots and everything I pulled to get the same amount of espresso that James used. Also, he triple filtered his coffee. I didn't want to go through the process of doing that since this was an experiment. So I did filter it once because I do want to get rid of those coffee oils. James used 3 different filters to make sure he got as much of the coffee and grounds and anything out of it that he could. Also, people have mentioned, and James mentioned, and I had also known about this before, you can add potassium bromide, which helps get rid of the haze or fogginess in this development process. Since this is, household items, it's not the exact chemical components you would normally use in D76, C41, that kind of thing. So potassium bromide helps get rid of any haze and fog you might get in your development. I didn't use that last time, nor did I use it this time, just because I wanted to see what I would get right out of the gate with as little as possible. And I'm going to go even further back. Eventually, I'll just try straight up coffee to see what kind of results I can get with that. Now, for that development process, it was an 11-minute development process. It was 1 minute of constant agitation and then 10 seconds every minute after that, followed by the same time that I used with the instant coffee for the fixer. I did make sure to let the coffee sit for a lengthy period of time. I wanted to make sure it was as close, if not at room temperature, before I bothered to use it. So I did make sure that that was the case. Lastly, before we look at the results, using regular coffee is not cheap. This bag of coffee cost me 15, 16 bucks. This is a light to medium roast. Again, we talked about light roast being important. How close this is, they couldn't quite tell me. It was the best I could find on such short notice locally. So I wouldn't think that would be too drastic to make a significant difference, but of course we could be wrong. But again, you want to stick towards the lighter roasts. So let's look at the results. So on the top, we have the instant coffee. As you can see, it is developed much more accurately this round than it was last round. Again, the only thing I changed was the agitation time. It was a 15-minute total with the first 2 minutes constant, 10 seconds every minute after that, whereas previously it was 11 minutes with 1 minute constant and 10 seconds every minute after that. So that, of course, made a big difference as long as everything else stayed the same compared to last time. I did use the RB67 this time as opposed to the Bronica. However, I metered exactly the same according to settings, film, and everything like that. So the top roll of film also was shot in the middle of the night. All I had was a few accent lights. I did it more kind of as like a product thing. I just want to see what I could get close up with the RB, see what kind of detail and things like that. Whereas the bottom roll of film, that was developed in the espresso coffee. Also, that was shot middle of the day, but you can see already between the two, the color difference. The top roll of film It's got a green tint and color to it, whereas the bottom is very clear, very black and white. To my knowledge, again, this is to my knowledge, the only reason that you would get that color shift in the same exact type of film, to my knowledge, is in the development process, or I guess perhaps maybe it was an older stock of film, I'm not sure. So you can see from looking at this that the contrast, the amount of detail and information that is in the two, it is much more prevalent in the bottom roll than it is in the top. The exposure was done accurately, so you can see how that kind of played a factor in. If we'll scroll through the shots right now, so, can you develop film in regular coffee as opposed to instant coffee? Yes, you can. Do you want to pull 9 shots of espresso just to dump into a canister of coffee that's going to cost you probably more than it would to send it off for development? Probably not. Instant coffee is going to be the way to go just because it is so cheap. Now, can you do it with regular coffee at a different scale? Now, if we pull it back and do, say, cold brew or do just regular drip, then we'd have to figure out the amount of soluble material we have to the amount of water. Again, for the espresso blend, we had 375 grams of espresso. So we still had 405 grams of water that we could have used in some sort of coffee concoction to get the total of 750 grams of water, liquid material that we needed before mixing it with the vitamin C and washing soda to get our complete chemical developing mix. So you have another 405 grams of water to play with there. Can you get the ratio you need out of drip or cold brew? I'm not sure. It's something I will eventually play with, but for now, I'm going to pull back on this. I have other projects and other things that I want to do. So the coffee thing, I think I can settle that for now and move on to other things. But I thought it would be interesting to show the difference between the instant and the regular. I do think the regular looks better. Again, we could play with different times and different ratios and things like that to kind of maybe bump up the instant coffee look. It could play into the fact that I shot the regular coffee during daylight as opposed to night, even though the exposures were accurate. There's a lot of things that can play into that. And with developing, it just takes time and experimenting and just kind of pushing and pulling the development time depending on what you want to do with your film, as well as what chemicals you're using, what film you're developing, all that kind of stuff. It all plays a factor. It just takes time to dial it in to where you need it to be for what kind of look you want to achieve out of your film. So that is going to wrap it up for round 2 of instant coffee versus regular coffee with developing film. I'm going to put these away for now and start shooting some color. So there'll be some cool stuff with that out soon. But for now, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you have questions about this, be sure to leave them down in the comments below. If I don't know, I'm sure somebody else will chime in and give the answers needed. Otherwise, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out those 2 videos I mentioned about beer and coffee separately to get a better idea of what's going to work best for you.